Hello there, it's Pete here. Now, recently we went past 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which seems like quite an exciting thing and something that definitely is worth marking in some way. And what better way than to give you a little bit of video? So today I'm going to give you a video conversation with our usual format of me talking to a very interesting author indeed. The book we're talking about is this one, Cruikshank's London, A Portrait of a City in 13 Walks. And the author, of course, is Dan Cruickshank, someone I'm sure is familiar to many of you in the UK for his broadcasting work on the BBC. But today he's going to talk to me about the city which he grew up in and which continues to enchant him, and more particularly still one famous year in London's history, which is 1666. I bet you can guess what we're going to talk about. I hope you enjoy it.
You're right at the start of your book, which is London, a portrait of a city in 13 walks, that it's a place that can delight, surprise, appall, break your heart, but it's rarely bland and hardly ever dull. It has a raw and rough beauty, and whereas it may lack the finesse of Paris, the antique grandeur of Rome, or the imperial presence of Vienna, it does have a tremendous soul. And if we put that together with this idea of a changing city, I wanted to ask you something which is a bit more personal about the London of your childhood that you first knew and the London of today. How much has it changed just within the span of our last maybe 50 years or so?
Yes, I should say I am a Londoner, born in London. I've lived in London. I've lived abroad as well and travelled very much in the last 20 years. The London of my youth was the post-war London. I mean, I was born in 1949, so I was growing up. I lived in Bloomsbury, actually, at that period with my family. And London was still largely a bomb site. Not largely a bomb site, but many bomb sites survived. And so as a child, this kind of overlaps, because I lived in Warsaw too, when I was about 9 or 10 with my family for various reasons. My father was working there. That was a city that had been entirely destroyed, really 90% in 1944 by the Nazis. So my childhood experience weirdly overlaps. My memories of the ruins of Warsaw being rebuilt, but really was tremendously destroyed, with my memories of London. But so it's hard to unpick one from the other, but I had this kind of childhood of wartime devastation. But I do remember some specific things in London. I mean, little things. I suppose, one's interest in things come from strange places. We are born the way we are. And I was interested in buildings from a child. I now realise more than I did realise at the time that was the case. But a lot of my details are very specific. So I remember, for example, the Barbican area. Now, the Barbican is a big housing. Those who probably know London will know the Barbican is built by City Corporation, 50s and 1960s, high-rise residential areas with an art centre and so on, just on the northern edge of the City of London. I remember it being built. I remember it as a gigantic demolition site, larger bomb site. I remember I was very young, but I remember noticing the doors had been used to form the hoardings. And I remember the doors were beautiful. They were presumably mostly Georgian doors, and they were either mahogany or nice moulded panelling and so on. So I have these very curious memories of London. One is a place of change, of things being swept away. When I returned to London, I should say, and I started to become more a sentient being, I suppose in my late teens, early 20s, I then realised even more than my youth the nature of change, because then the bomb sites had been filled more or less, but there was a hunger to create sites for development. And I guess I was shocked by the amount of demolition one saw. Again, I thought those doors were beautiful. I saw beautiful buildings, mostly 18th century terrace houses being swept away. All I could do at that time was photograph, document. I have my negative still, tens of thousands of photographs of lost London, the humble streets. I again became interested, I suppose, not on monumental London. That was not so much under threat, I suppose, the great buildings, but the humble buildings that made up the basic building fabric of London, the ordinary houses. They struck me. I realised at the time they'd been built in the 1720s, 30s and early 19th century. as homes and speculation to make money for builders. There's nothing new in that, is there? But they had become works of art almost by accident, and they created a most beautiful backdrop. And I was heartbroken to see that change coming in, the remorseless demolition of the very fabric that gave London its character and its soul. And I must say that fight has been, it goes on to this day. I've never stopped my quest to try and halt a destruction of beauty. So I say I've always been, so London, to conclude, it became clear to me that one, it was a product of change, and the change, though ghastly, could indeed produce, as it did in the 18th century, works of art by accident, the great sprawling terraces of London. But I say it was not a place where the beauty was on the surface. You had to have a feeling for it and enjoy it. And like all great cities, of course, and you could name all great cities on one hand in a way, not only ancient cities, but cities which have gone through turmoils. I mean, New York is another one, I suppose. But there are layers. And the more you look, the more you see. And no matter how long you look, you'll always find something new, something more to discover. Interestingly, on the 13 Walks book, I've walked the streets of London for decades upon decades, constantly, I suppose, from the late 1960s. But goodness me, I set out my walks. And of course, everything changes by light and conditions change. And of course, buildings come and go. So you will find something new, and your heart will break. Something you loved has been over-restored or swept away. But I mean, I did still find new things. It was an amazing experience, confirming when I wrote those words. I wrote it after the experience of doing the walk, and I just tried to analyse what it is that is thrilling about London. And as I say, it's rough, it's kind of rude in some cases, and defined, I say, not by surface beauty, but by a depth of soul.
So I want to just take a kind of a practical element out of the book about 13 Walks before we begin on our own kind of tour into the past. It's subtitled A Portrait of the City in 13 Walks. But if there was maybe someone who was going to come and experience London for the first time, because we have lots of international listeners, this may well be the case, that someone is planning a visit to London for the very, very first time. What would Cruikshank's number one introductory walk to London be? What was the one that you'd absolutely say people should do?
Yeah, it's interesting. It obviously depends the mood and what one wants and what one expects. I mean, there are contained walks from the magical world of Hampstead Heath. I suppose if there was one, it's that kind of linear walk, which I think is broken down into a couple of walks, but it's very straightforward. It's basically going back to the notion that London was, as far as we understand it, founded by the Romans, Londinium, though of course there clearly were settlements here before that. The evidence is there. But London as a city, what we take cities to be, a mixture of buildings, public and private and planned and so on and so forth, basically is Roman. And so the Roman streets do not really survive because the history of London is such that it was abandoned, recolonized in the 9th century. The Roman city was largely lost below rubble, and then new buildings took place. And so the Roman street pattern does not generally survive. Fragments do. But having said that, there is this kind of ancient route which the Romans either created or which they adopted from the early, Bronze Age times, I suppose, trade routes, which is basically the great route north to south in a way, then swinging west through London. That's my linear walk. So basically it's from Spitalfields, where I am now, on Ermine Street. Bishopsgate was Roman Ermine Street, the great road going north to York and Lincoln and so on and so forth. And then that you go on that road from just outside the city wall, outside Bishopsgate, just outside Liverpool Street Station, and continue and goes south, and then swing to the west, and you go along Cheapside as a straight route to St Paul's, then you do Ludgate Hill, Fleet Street, the Strand, and so on. That is a tremendous walk, because you're going through the very heart of London. You're partly connecting with the surviving Roman street pattern to a large degree, There are other Roman street patterns you could follow, Oxford Street, for example. And through that, you go through residential London, the high and the low Londons, the princely London, the business London, residential London towards the Strand. Strand was a London of palaces, and so on. So you have, and then there's Covent Garden just to the north. So it's a tremendous experience walking literally through the history and heart of London from Roman times to now.
Well, that's a perfect choice, and one that we can illustrate and put upon our website to show people exactly where they should go, but also an opportunity for me to say that in Cruikshank's London, you've inserted so many photographs. I imagine many of those are your own. There's lots of plans and maps and paintings and things of the past. So it's a real kind of, it almost feels like a mix of a scrapbook, a commonplace book, and a non-fiction history book at the same time. So it's a great blend of all sorts of things. We're going to put up information on that as well. But let's get into the business of the day, because you're going to not just take us across geographic space, but backwards through linear time as well today, because I'm going to ask you the question I always ask to everyone when they come on this podcast of ours. If you could travel back through time, Dan Cruickshank, which calendar year would you pick to visit?
Well, that's a difficult question, isn't it? Particularly with London, and there are so many key dates. But there is an obvious one. It may be so obvious you wonder why I'm doing it. I'm sure maybe others have done it before, but it's the Great Fire, 1666. Because if ever there was a moment, a year, when London's nature was changed, obviously dramatically by the Great Fire, which, just to remind you, burned from early 2nd of September 1666 for 5 or 6 days. It devoured 5/6 of the city, most of the city within the wall, apart from near me, which is the northeast, Bishopsgate Street in the wall, and west along Fleet Street. It laid low London. What is interesting about the Great Fire, I suppose, in many ways, is not just what was the London changed, but England was changed, and part of the world was changed by the consequences of the Great Fire. The rebuilding was a phenomenal business. It was rapid and it worked well. It worked well despite the fact that there was no powerful overall body in control, and that to do with the context that which the Great Fire happened. Because you've got to think what was going on, the year just before and after. I mean, it's very odd, isn't it? I mean, the Civil War wasn't long ago, and that obviously a huge, a tremendously huge event in the history of England, Britain, and indeed the world. The people of this nation overthrew a monarchy which ruled by divine right, apparently appointed by God to rule. The Stuarts were found wanting, and indeed Charles I had his head cut off in January, 1649. A huge drama, obviously huge drama, and it became, this country became a Commonwealth. Well, the more curious still, of course, is that the Commonwealth in 1660 invited Charles I's son back, Charles II, to rule. It restored him as a parliamentary monarch, no longer a divine monarch, but a monarch who ruled by the will of Parliament. Parliament being elected by a limited number of the population, of course, but nevertheless it was answerable democratically to the people of the country, and the monarch was answerable to Parliament. So obviously fundamentally different. That was only, of course, 6 years before the Great Fire. The king's role was very strange, very controversial, obviously. He was parliamentary, so he was subject to parliamentary control, as I say, financed by Parliament. He was subject to all manner of restrictions, and certainly his power was limited. And there was, I say, gigantic suspicion about the king's intentions, about his allegiances. Bear in mind, he'd been in exile in the Low Countries and in France. He was very influenced and dependent on French culture, French money, Louis XIV. There was the whole rumour of his relationship with Roman Catholicism. Remember, this country since Henry VIII's time, the dissolution of the monasteries, the English monarchs had to be Protestant. So, and Charles was, but it was uncertain. And then there was, just lots of extraordinary cavortings at the court, you might say. French influence, strange personalities arrive, fashions become exuberant. There's a Puritan backlash going on constantly, a feeling that this is ungodly, and that the court was debauched and decadent, and that there would be some sort of divine punishment. And my goodness, we had the plague, and then we had the fire. These are divine punishments, if ever you want them in biblical terms, don't you? Biblical, the fire and brimstone and pestilence. So there was that context of the Great Fire. It was many people saw it as punishment for the political wrong turn that had been taken by re-establishing a curious monarchy, a king without real powers, and so on. So when the fire took place, I said there wasn't a central force to enforce a comprehensive rebuilding, because the king didn't have the money, didn't have the power to do that, because of course the city, as burnt, was in many different ownerships, and the various people who'd lost their warehouses, their homes, their businesses, wanted to rebuild as quickly as possible. So there was a kind of a attempt to create visionary plans, of which maybe more in a moment, but they were not possible to be imposed. Also, by the way, got to bear in mind that year, 1666. Well, but Britain was engaged in a trade war with the Dutch. Second Dutch War, Second Anglo-Dutch War had been going on. It hadn't been going well for England at all. There'd been a series of battles earlier, naval battles earlier in 1666, where the Dutch had triumphed tremendously in what was called the 4 days fight in June. Huge battle lasting 4 days. British had lost, I think, 10 ships, the Dutch a couple of ships. It was a Dutch victory, strategically not conclusive. Then there have been other engagements. The British had descended upon a Dutch island and burnt Dutch ships very meanly, quite cruel. They looted a town. The Dutch were horrified. So that was part of the context, of the Great Fire. This country was at war, and the war wasn't going well. And so many people thought when the fire started, in mysterious circumstances, that it was treachery. It's either a whole list of people, the French, who we're not at war with, but they remain traditional enemies, and people were very suspicious because of the French influence on the court and finances of the King, Charles II. The Catholic threat, of course, always there. The Catholics from Spain doing this, and then there was, of course, the Dutch in some amazing acts of sabotage and burnt the capital of their enemy. So it was an astonishing moment. And also, by the way, curious, the aftermath, the Puritans, there was an idea, of the year 1666, Book of Revelations, 666, the year of man, it puts the year of the beast, the year of the Antichrist. All this fed into the strange events of 1666, always making it a year of magic and mystery. Very strange time.
Yeah, it's a great overview there. I think it's nice that you alighted on that idea about 1666 being a slightly unsettling one for people with the connection to the Book of Revelation. But when you set that against the licentious court, or what people have an idea as being a slightly, because I suppose there's been a great swing, hasn't it? It's only 10 years since we had Puritanism, Oliver Cromwell, the cancellation of Christmas, all of this. And then all of a sudden we have the 1660s are in a way a bit like the 1960s. You have a kind of swinging London before its time, don't you? Because the theatres come back and they'd been banned as well. And so so it's these two things, one against the other. And as you said, the plague is seen very much as a kind of providential intervention and maybe something that people should take heed of. One question I wanted to ask, though, in getting to your architectural specialisms, is about if we kind of were at the start of the year, say the 1st of January, what kind of London are we looking at? Is this essentially a medieval city? Is it?
Yeah. Well,
place?
good, very important point. After the fire, the analysis of the fire was much. Many people had to go, and of course Pepys' diary, which is terrific, day by day, blow by blow, very emotive, very beautifully, powerfully written. He gives a picture of London. He talks about that the warehouses full of oils, the goods combustible down by the river where the fire started, Pudding Lane. He talks about buildings being old and timber. It'd been a particularly dry summer, so the buildings being tinder dry, closely packed, being timber, obviously, and their goods, the merchants' goods, all contribute. London was an interesting city. We know quite a lot from it, really, because what's odd, the first maps of London, it is strange. The first map of London, presenting London in a consistent manner as an overview to Londoners who could see their city, is not till 1550s, the famous copperplate map, so-called. And then there's other maps in Brown and Hogenberg in 1571. And you can see from those maps the nature of the London that burnt 100 years later. Yes, closely packed streets. I say the Roman city had been lost under debris and smaller streets, a pattern that had evolved from the 9th century onwards. A few Roman streets, like Bishopsgate, kind of lingered on it in part. So, yes, higgledy-piggledy, small streets, closely packed. The maps make it clear that was the case, and you get an idea of the architecture, 2- and 3-story buildings, densely packed together on street frontages, not as uniform compositions, that's a thing of the 17th and 18th century, but gabled, bricks, plaster, a lot of timber, gabled elevations, small courts, a lot of alleys. So you get that, you can see how this is a disaster waiting to happen if a fire takes hold in particular circumstances, and those circumstances obviously came to pass when the fire broke out. And the city, of course, fascinatingly, a sacred city, like Rome or Jerusalem in a sense. It was always conceived as that, really, governed by 24 aldermen, rather like the 24 elders sitting around Christ in the book of Revelation, at the Guildhall, 87 churches springing up within the walls of the city thereabouts. So a tremendous place, very strong, very powerful, and of course then a great trade city, which was the war with the Dutch Republic was about.
Can I also just clarify another thing? Well, there's two things which I want to just touch on quickly. So, and this is something which is really important to London's identity today, although some people might not understand it or appreciate it, is that London really was two different cities, wasn't it? You had Westminster in the west, which was a kind of political centre where you have the Houses of Parliament and so on, and Westminster Hall and Westminster Abbey. And then towards the east, you had the City of London. And is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is absolutely correct. I mean, I suppose one has to recognise the dual nature of London at the time of the fire. So there's the city, the walled city, which is essentially the Londinian, the Roman city, which becomes the merchant city, the money-making city, which is East End defined by the Tower of London, built by William the Conqueror in the 1070s. But interestingly, even when the conquest took place after Battle of Hastings, 1066, London already had a duality, because there was the Roman walled city, but then to the west, following the river, going west from the city, from Ludgate, which is where St Paul's is, Ludgate Hill, Fleet Street, the Strand, gets on to Thorney Island, to Westminster. Well, interestingly, there had been a settlement there in Roman times. There's no question about that, because evidence has been found. And there was a great abbey built there. Edward the Confessor became Westminster Abbey. And then the Normans inherited this notion of there being this city down there, and William Rufus, king after William the Conqueror, builds a great Westminster Hall in the late 11th century. And that then becomes the core of the Palace of Westminster. That becomes the great royal centre, a place of royal power, with courtiers gathered round. So you have the merchant city, which the East End of which is defined also by the court, in a sense. The Tower of London was also a palace, described as such. And then far to the west was Westminster, and the Norman court, royal court, created in the Palace of Westminster next to the Abbey. And that grows through the centuries. It's reinforced. Other monarchs add more buildings to the Palace of Westminster, making it more substantial, and then there's more courtiers living around it. And interestingly, the Strand becomes this street of palaces. We often forget about it, but it was famous into the 18th century, certainly from the late Middle Ages, a whole array of palaces for great courtiers. Essex House, some of them were religious. So there was also Durham Palace, York Palace, Salisbury, and Bedford Palace, Bedford House in Covent Garden. The only reminder now, really, is Somerset House, which was built again, medieval building, rebuilt hugely in the 1540s, one of London's great first classical buildings. So it's very interesting. So the Strand becomes this intermediate world connecting the royal Palace Westminster with the merchant city of London. It had it was astride there's two camps, so to speak. That's where the men of power had their bases.
That's the important dynamic that I think we have to bear in mind. And also, it just takes us to this character that you mentioned. I just wanted to clarify who he is in case people do not know. So Samuel Pepys is an interesting character here because he's very famously a diarist and a great source to the period for us all today. But in a geographic sense, he's quite useful because I seem to remember that he grew up in, was it just south of Fleet Street was where his childhood home was. So he's kind of a figure who grew up between the cities of London and Westminster, but also moved between them in his professional life as well as someone who had great influence at the court, but was very involved in the kind of more practical businesses that you would find. In a city.
Pepys is the great Londoner. Interesting. He's an administrator, so he's not a sailor, but he does administer the Navy office. He's a clerk to the Acts, it's called, which is basically the guy, civil servant in charge. You might say chief secretary to the Admiralty. So he has a major role as that, and in that capacity, he has meetings with the lords of the land, and certainly with Charles II regularly, and with his brother, the Duke of York, future James II. And so he's a terrific position to, for an insider view about how things work. He, of course, has a pretty bad time because during the Second Dutch War, 1665, that's going on, 1667 is one that's going on during the fire, because the Royal Navy is not doing very well. And so Pepys has a few questions to answer about what's gone wrong with my ships, the King may well ask, but I say at the time of the fire, he's living near the Tower of London in Seething Lane. Seething Lane does survive. Indeed, it's just about survived the fire, amazingly. So he's living in Seething Lane, just to the west of the Tower of London. And so is well positioned to witness the beginnings, the middle, the fight, the kind of hopelessness of the first responses, and then to witness its end.
We're going to look at this fire, and we're going to look at it through our 3-scene format as ever. Okay. So let's go to the first one. And you've kind of picked, it's Sunday, the 2nd of September, and it's early morning. I mean, you can give us a location. Where would you want to be if you were to...
Well, I think if I would be sitting alongside Pepys, I think. Though, mind you, his first diary entry is about 2:00 in the morning. But how a great tragedy starts is very interesting, isn't it? Because he's woken up by James, one of the servants, who's kind of preparing the Sunday feast. Poor woman, she doesn't get very early to start doing the cooking, and she simply points out to him that there's some smoke over there. What's going on? And he looks out the window and he sees indeed some smoke, and he thinks it's a long way off, and a house is burning down. There we go. And he goes back to bed and thinks all will be well. And then he gets up again later on and realizes all is not going to be well, because his fire is now mighty and it's blazing around Pudding Lane, which is near London Bridge. Bear that in mind, London Bridge is an inhabited bridge. It's the only major bridge across the Thames in central London. It's packed with about 100 houses, medieval houses, Tudor houses, a lot of them are timber, and they're starting to burn as well. And so
Is it a stone bridge or a timber bridge?
The bridge is stone. Peter Wall, it's a bit of culture to build. He was a No, all bridges. It was built is completed about 1209, and it's multi-arch stone bridge. And the houses appear a bit later. It becomes London's great shopping street, really, in the Tudor period in the 17th century, packed with about 100 buildings, many of which are shops. But the structure is stone. Indeed, the bridge survived until it was demolished in the 1830s for 1820s for the London Bridge that replaced it. So yeah, the bridge is essentially is okay, but the buildings on it are not. And so anyway, so what Pepys does, of course, so other Londoners, they go and they realise something terrible is happening, and people are in a great panic. And he says repeatedly, that no one's fighting the fire. Everyone's just running around trying to salvage their goods, their possessions, their household goods, the things from the warehouses, moving them from one place to another. And they get to somewhere else, and that place then gets burnt. They're going to move this up again, and things are lying in the street. Whole men's treasures of people's family homes, just cast in the streets because the things being dropped. Absolute mayhem. This becomes one of the accusations that are levelled in the inquiries afterwards. There was no consistent or coherent pattern of response to actually fighting the fire. Everyone was panicking and trying to save their household goods and clogging the streets with carts. That's witnessed by Pepys.
Isn't one of the it's one of the things that I've always remembered about the fire that the Lord Mayor in particular was a bit too relaxed in his response. So he famously something like that. That's one of the
yeah. I mean, but interestingly, the Lord Mayor does feature in Pepys' accounts, because this is going on, day one or day two. He realizes, he's got a major responsibility, secretary to the Navy. The Chief Navy's full of naval records. What earth are we going to do with these important records? The fire is getting nearer. Then also there's Pepys' own kind of private possessions, his food. Remember, he buries his Parmesan cheese in his friend's garden to try and preserve it. Later on, he takes other possessions, gold and so on, to Deptford and Woolwich. He has connections there through the Navy. So he's worried about his personal stuff, about his state responsibility. He gets on a barge and goes to Whitehall and sees Charles II and the Duke of York to give them a first-hand account of what he's seen. This is the beginning of the fire, the first day. And he talks about the panic, and there was no consistent pattern, no plan. All they can say is that we would dispatch troops to try and create some order, and we have to blow up houses. Big deal. The houses are private property. All they can think of, and they're quite right, I suppose, to try and create fire breaks. Pepys goes back. He goes to Canning Street, Watling Street, and he does confront the Lord Mayor, who's wandering around. But he obviously by this time he'd realised if he'd had said about woman could put out that he'd mistaken the situation. He's absolutely frazzled with a handkerchief around his neck, saying, I am spent, I do not know what to do. I try to give orders, no one listens to me, everyone's in panic. And he's the figure of authority, and he's in that completely collapsed state. What is to be done?
So I think just at this point, it's worth saying that we do know now what the like kind of the original point of the fire was. It was in Pudding Lane. It was in the house of a baker, wasn't it? And he had not cleaned his chimney or something. And
well, fun enough, yes. I mean, but Pepys in the first diary entry, which is Sunday the 2nd of September 1666, says all that. He says, so down with my heart full of trouble to the lieutenant of the Tower, who tells me that it begun this morning in the King's baker's house in Pudding Lane. And then he goes on to say it's burned at Magdalene Church. So from the start, people recognise this idea, the proposition that's how it had started, a small fire in the King's Baker in Pudding Lane, which is a site now marked, of course, by the post-fire monument designed by Wren and Hooke. Interesting, though, so one could go, I mean, what's interesting, I suppose, to my mind in many ways is the vigour of Pepys's description. I mean, I don't want to do readings for you today. I could if you want me to, but there's a tremendous one, though. He's in a flutter, trying to do his duty by the Navy Board, save his own possessions, terrified of the welfare of various friends. He sees the area where they live being consumed by fire, particularly London Bridge, and is just overwhelmed by the sight. And at one point, he goes across the river, the south bankside, to an inn, and just has this amazing description of the scene before him, of an arc of fire, a mile wide, with and a terrible sound, not a sound of burning that you're familiar with, burning logs in your grate, but a ferocious, demonic crackling, and the heat and the sparks and the falling bits of debris you're covered with. I mean, this is it's absolutely direct and visceral description, and you're aware of the enormity of this calamity. And at that time, people are saying, who started this? It must be treachery. And there's all sorts of ideas about who it could be. I mentioned before, the Dutch, the French, the Spaniards. Any foreigner in the streets is in terrible trouble. And there's reports of incendiaries being spotted. And a fire would suddenly break out in a street that had not been burnt in one house. I guess probably because sparks had fallen on that particular houses, maybe thatched or timber work, thatched roof. But then there's a great cry, there's evidence, someone is setting these fires, and great, hue and cry. What's amazing, of course, as far as one understands it, only about 6 people were killed. Actually, no one died in the fire. So odd that, isn't it? I mean, because it was not only ferocious, but it was obviously spreading pretty fast. But people kept out of harm's way. I mean, it's not clear, and because, of course, the population is not well documented. There isn't a census. People could have been burnt to the point they couldn't be recognised. No one's quite sure. What about the itinerant, the poor? We do not really know. But of recorded lives of people who are documented, it's very small. That's one of the mysteries of the fire, of course.
Yeah. And can I just take a step back to ask you about fire in London in general? So if we were kind of considering this moment when Pepys is having, he's absorbing the fact that there's an enormous destructive fire raging through the city. Is this to him an event of it's very unusual, it's extraordinary, or do fires in a city so closely built up and so thickly populated, was this a normal factor of life, or do you know of any particular fires even in more distant London history?
No, fires were a fact of life. People accepted it. I mean, obviously there is no fire service. The world changed, I say, in many ways after the Great Fire. One great way it changed was the idea of introducing a kind of fire service for those who paid their insurance. There was no such thing as fire insurance, a novel concept. It was invented after the Great Fire, because obviously you're bolting the stable. But the notion that fires were a fact of life was there, but no one really figured out that there were things you could do to mitigate, like having insurance. Fire insurance starts actually in 1681. By a man called Nick Barber, who's a great speculative figure, a figure in the rebuilding of London as a speculative builder. That's maybe another story, fascinating story. Fires, but they're contained. People generally managed to contain them within a street, put them out, and so it's a fact of life, but they hadn't been catastrophic. There are other great fires, of course, in English. There's the Great Fire of Northampton a few years later. So they are they're things that happen.
They're a fact of life.
Yeah, but London had not suffered a gigantic fire. There have been small fires on a regular basis, but not to get into the chronicles. But if you look into it, you'll find them. So which is why Pepys, I think, is relaxed, and he sees his fire in the morning. Oh, another fire. Well, okay, it'll be okay. They'll take care of it.
Well, just to kind of,
I should say.
Well, I'm just going to consolidate what you're saying and give a bit of quantification as well. It said on that Sunday night, around 1,000 shops and houses had been destroyed just on the Sunday night. And so it is far beyond the confines of what would be seen as a small fire. And as you said, the rumours were spreading that the Dutch and the French had fired the city. So that's, I suppose, understandable given the political climate that you described earlier on. Shall we go to the next scene, which I think is going to catch the fire probably on Wednesday, the 5th of September, which is, a few days later. Again with Pepys, and I just want to see this moment, if you can take us there to see how the fire progressed over the next few days, just how much damage was it doing, and were they getting it under control?
No, it's still not under control. Looking at the diary entry, so he's sleeping rough at his home on someone's quilt. He gets up weary. The fire then actually at the end of Seething Lane, he talks about near Barking Church, where that's All Hallows by the Tower, church that survives. It was bombed in the Second World War, but then they're still there. He calls it Barking Church because the land had belonged to Barking Abbey before the dissolution. So it's at the edge of his street. And so this is when he really starts thinking seriously about his own personal welfare. And that's when he starts packing up his goods, and he takes his stuff down to Woolwich and down to Deptford.
He buries it, of course.
Well, he buries some. Some goes to Bethnal Green later on, Bednall Green, as he calls it.
I suppose this stands for the experience of so many other people who are doing the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's the balance, isn't it? He's trying to do is, he sees the Duke of York, he sees the King, he sees the Lord Mayor, he talks about fire breaks, which obviously was the solution in the end, blowing up houses, getting the military involved. He has a major role, partly because he is the guardian of his naval records, but then also he has this thing about his own welfare. His house is just on the edge of the fire; it's creeping nearer and nearer. In the end, of course, he has to also think about his own good. So there's this balancing act, and it does seem unstoppable. I mean, at this point, he's already noted, or is continuing to note, the causes for it. The timber houses, the warehouses full of oil and combustibles, trying to make sense of how has this thing got so rapidly out of control.
Because there's one other thing that I wanted to ask you about that we haven't had time to alight on yet, which is the role of the King and his brother James, Duke of York, during the period of the fire. Because I know there's an interpretation that there was a suspicion about the King in 1666. Generally, he was like a fashionable figure, but some people were not sure about his moral behaviour.
Yeah, sure.
But he actually takes an active role in organising the response at almost a street level. And I mean,
yes.
Is that right?
Yes. I think it's very right. I mean, I think it's correct. Often Charles is misunderstood these days and simply seen as a merry monarch, but he was a powerful figure struggling with very difficult circumstances because basically the nature of his monarchy was odd, wasn't it? Invited to rule by the people once ruling, subject to parliamentary control, but he's trying to have authority over parliament. So, but in the Great Fire, his best side comes forward. There are many examples of his best side coming forward. For example, when the French Huguenots are fleeing persecution in their own country, in Catholic France, he welcomes them. He's dependent on the French, but he says, we must welcome these Protestant strangers and give them help. And that's in the early 1680s. So constantly, he's displaying a heart and a huge common sense. And in the fire, Pepys goes to see him and the Duke of York on the first day in Whitehall. He explains the situation to them in first-hand terms. He says, very agitated. And they say, well, the only solution is radical. We have to blow up, create fire breaks. And they ask Pepys to return by barge on the river to the city and see the Lord Mayor and organise that. And Pepys attempts to do that, and he meets the Lord Mayor in distress and dismay in Watling Street or Canning Street, anyway, and he's distress. So it doesn't really happen. Then he meets the King and the Duke of York on a barge, and the next day in the river they're there watching it, trying to work out what to do. Send troops in to enforce some discipline and to organise the gunpowder, organise the blowing up of houses, which is what happens. So the King is very directly engaged. He's very directly engaged with many things. I mean, he's engaged with the trade conflict with the Dutch. When the war ends in 1667, Charles is rational. He says, well, we've lost this war. We don't want to fight the Dutch anymore. We want to learn from them. We want to copy them. But he's realistic. He sees what had gone wrong in the British effort, and he quite, I say, sort of detached and just sees how the way forward. So he's interesting.
So where would you like to go for your third scene?
Well, I suppose to conclude the sequence, we should go to Friday, the 7th of September, with Samuel Pepys again. But by the 7th is a famous day. He says, "Oh well, wake up 5 o'clock, and blessed to God to find all as well. The fire is quelled. The blowing up of houses has worked. The wind has abated. It is burnt itself out, and rather than being stopped." But these days, and he's then beginning to look at it's amazing. Those familiar places, those landmarks, those timeless, enduring monuments that have been there for centuries, St Paul's Cathedral, and to see the state they're in, it's absolutely shocking. But being Pepys, of course, he's overwhelmed by the destruction of history, of beauty, of permanence, great structures of state, of religion, of trade. And he notes them as they are in ruins. Also, he notes the poor pigeons who wouldn't leave their homes, and he sees these pigeons fluttering around their pigeon coops and the flames burning their feathers. He also talks at St Paul's about finding a cat in the ruins that had been burnt. Very interesting Pepys. It's humanity, but his observation, the details, bring it all home. What do fires really mean? They mean, like, yes, pigeons as fireballs falling from the sky, horrible, floods thudding at your feet. So not just a whole arc of fire over a mile of city, but also these terrible, sad details of the singed cat, the pigeon, and the Parmesan cheese being buried in a neighbour's garden, his best Parmesan cheese. Didn't worry about his second best, left that to the flames, I suppose. So anyway, it is astonishing, but it also is interesting to understand this to a degree by looking at the immediate inquiries. There's a man called John Strite who publishes a book called The Surveys of the City of London and Westminster, published in 1720, which is a revision of a book by John Stowe, published in 1590s, sorry. And he has a great section on the fire, trying to analyse what had caused it. Interesting things, about 10 major points. The weekend, the combustible houses, the city merchants being away, they're weekending. They've left their homes in the hands of lazy servants who don't plan things. This is kind of trying to explain the kind of embarrassing panic and chaos. It's not the great merchants there at the weekend retreats. It's their servants who don't know how to deal with things. This is kind of the interesting undercurrent that emerges. And also, he talks again about this idea of incendiaries, this kind of subplot that somehow there's all enemies of the state are behind all this. So you begin to get it kind of fleshes out the scene described, I say, in visceral terms by Pepys. You can get this, inquiry, the facts stacked up, and then of course by the time Strype is publishing, 1720s. London has been rebuilt. Because what also Strype talks about is the miracle. If it had been a divine punishment for the court and for excesses and so on, the plague and the Great Fire, then the rebuilding was deemed to be a miracle, a sign of God's blessing, because it was quickly done. There were these tremendous visionary plans produced by the end of 1666. So Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, who was a friend of Wren's, a surveyor, and John Evelyn had produced 3 plans for the royal court. They were too visionary, didn't come to being because there wasn't the money, there wasn't the control, they couldn't be created. But they represent an interesting point in a cultural point of development, because all of those plans had consequences. There was another plan by a man called Richard Harcourt that was eventually became the plan in every major way for the city of Philadelphia, as it happened. So there was that stuff going on. And then there's a kind of the mechanisms, there's a great big building act passed in 1667 to try and prevent such a thing happening again. So it makes sure houses are built more solidly of brick and stone, not timber and plaster. It relates height of house to width of street. I say non-combustible materials. It kind of creates a sense of uniformity, 4 types of dwelling, simple fronts, no reduced timber ornament. That becomes the building block on which the great wonder of Georgian architecture is built in the 18th century. And it's interesting, the tax on coal. So there's a kind of idea that the nation has to help. There had been a tax on coal from the Middle Ages, but it becomes a big deal. All coal brought into London is subject to a hefty tax. But coal is not a luxury; it's essential for living, for cooking, for heating, everything. So coal is taxed, and the coal tax money is used to rebuild public buildings, the churches, and certainly St Paul's Cathedral, with the parishes finding the money to build the interiors of buildings. So, a mechanism, a planning mechanism, a financial mechanism are created after the Great Fire. And so within 4 or 5 years, as Strike points out, the city has rebuilt itself, not on a master plan envisaged by Hooke or Wren, but there's some street improvements, but essentially it's the old pattern rebuilt. That's the only way it could be done. There's no power to compulsory purchase, no money for a great princely project. It has to be done by the merchants themselves. They rebuild, but with some improvements. But of course, there are other things one should say about the Great Fire. I mean, one thing, because of the amount of destruction, and because the city did bounce back and trade did not collapse, the merchants lost their goods, they lost their place of trade, but they were dynamic and determined for it to be catastrophic in every term. So they rebuild and trade gets going. And because there is a huge demand for buildings, obviously, and this leads to the refinement of this system of building that we now call speculative building. Hence, there's a man called Nick Barbon, who's a great speculative builder. There's a huge demand for buildings, and obviously the supply of those buildings is pretty sure to make profits. And the spec building process, by which virtually all of Britain's cities were built in the 18th and 19th century, speculations by speculators, is refined in the city. And what's interesting about the city, when it rebuilds itself, 1690s, certainly 1670s to a degree, 1680s. I mean, St Paul's is not completed until 1711, but the city church is often completed by the 1670s, 1680s. These speculating builders go on. They've got a system working. It makes money. And so this is one of the reasons London expands so much after the Great Fire, because speculators like Nick Barbon find plots on the edge of London to continue the spec process. Nick Barbon starts demolishing houses along the Strand, palaces like Essex House. He demolishes that amongst great dismay, actually, great conservation matter, say it's failed to turn it into building plots. Essex Street survives on the junction of Fleet Street and the Strand. And in my area here in Spitalfields, he lays out the old artillery grounds in the 1680s as streets of houses. So that process of speculation is one of the reasons why people like Defoe in the 1720s or Walpole were amazed, because London had expanded hugely, because there was a system of speculation in place which made building a profitable exercise interesting.
It's a wonderful opportunity for us just to kind of survey as well, maybe at a bit of a 2 steps back distance. What was the kind of the final toll of the Great Fire? You said, was it almost all of the old walled city had gone? How far was the extent of the fire damage?
Well, okay. Well, I mean, of the city, the general consensus afterwards about 5/6 of the city. So that's most of the city within the wall. The little corner, the northeast corner around Bishopsgate Street within the walls, that survived. And you still see buildings, pre-fire buildings that are there. St Helens, Bishopsgate, for example, it's medieval church, that is there. So about 375 acres were levelled, and that goes west beyond the city wall, beyond St Paul's, beyond Ludgate Hill, along Fleet Street, as far really as the temple is now, and the fire stops there. So the great finger of destruction west along the Strand.
Last question for you, if we can just squeak it in. And I didn't warn you about this, so you'll have to think on your feet. We always like to offer people an opportunity for a tiny bit of material history. If you could have a memento from 1666, a tangible thing that you could have brought back to have perhaps in your Spitalfield home today, is there anything you would like in particular?
May I tell you, my house is full of tangible mementos of the Great Fire. Anyone in London who wants to get hold of something from the Great Fire, don't try very hard. The debris from the fire was spread around the edge of London. If you think about it, the buildings that survived the Great Fire, for example, the Guildhall, there it is, 15th century Guildhall. It's not in a hole in the ground. The fake fire, like Pompeii, created a huge mound of debris, burnt things, fallen bits of building and rubble. What happened to that rubble? It was obviously cleared away to go back to the pre-fire ground level. A lot of that stuff came to Spitalfields. It was dumped on the Spitalfields on the open ground after 1666 to level the ground here, to raise it above flooding, and to create a plateau on which speculating builders such as Nick Barban operated. So whenever a hole is dug in many parts of London, certainly here, you put your hand down and you pluck out fire rubble. I've done that many times. I even have a joist dug up quite deep in the area here that's burnt. I've got endless clay pipes from the 1660s, wig curlers, slipware, spongeware, Dutch tinglays. It's everywhere. My house is full of it, and I don't doubt my own analysis. It is the authentic stuff.
Well, you're one
fire. It's there. That's what I like fragments.
You're one step ahead of us. But I tell you what, for once we'll make a bit of an amendment, and I'll give you, metaphorically at least, a bit of Pepys's Parmesan cheese. You can have that, and it's about lunchtime, so you can
Look forward to it. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd prepare it. But anyway, Dan Cruickshank, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you today. Hugely enlightening, great fun, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Dan Cruickshank about this book, Cruikshank's London, A Portrait of the City in 13 Walks. I'm sure it's a book that will appeal to so many people. If you found that interesting, if you found 17th century society that we were talking about enchanting, as I continue to do, then go and check out our podcast feed as well today, because we've got another episode up with a naval historian called Nigel Pickford, which is all about the year 1682 and a shipwreck that very, very nearly did change the course of English history. Do check that out. But until next time, thank you for watching today. We'll see you again very, very soon.